Welcome folks to the 2021 Ashoka U Conference. We'll be sharing a little bit about our social justice tour here. And my name is Kira, and my co-hosts are here that will also be sharing a little bit more. And let me just get to where we are. So before we kick this off, I really want to give us a little bit of space to welcome kind of moving around and what we're doing today. But first, I'm going to ask everybody to take a breath as we arrive. So a deep breath in. And Susan, as we're doing this, you're going to continue to let people into the room. They're going to continue to come through. So there are folks in the waiting room right now. And as those folks arrive, I want to welcome folks, and we're going to welcome a couple of different things. So today we are going to welcome what is asking to be invited. We are going to welcome the question about where and how we belong. We are welcoming this great transition that we are all in. We welcome the masculine and feminine that shows up in each and every one of us. We welcome our bodies and the different ways you're experiencing yours exactly as they are. We welcome that which needs care or hospice or tending and warmth. We welcome our ancestors and ourselves as future ancestors. We welcome the parts of us that need comfort and the parts that want to be challenged. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed multiple descent. We welcome all the languages spoken here. And if you want to take a moment and share what languages that you speak in the chat, that would be amazing. We welcome the cities, states, countries we are representing, either as us or the people before us, where we are or where we are deeply connected. We welcome different spiritual and religious practices or lack thereof. We welcome disability, visible or invisible. We welcome gay, lesbian, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of these labels fit. And we welcome those who support you to be here, your families, genetic and otherwise. And as we move through this day, we want to welcome the other aspects of ourselves that maybe weren't covered in this particular list. Okay. Let's see. So just a quick outline. This is our agenda for today, a little bit of the setting of the context. What is the social justice tour and those core elements to our approach? We'll talk a bit about co-creation, self-awareness, a sample of the Grinnell Social Justice Tour, and workshopping the foundations of your own tour. We actually might move a couple of these things around just to make sure that we have the kind of time that we want to spend together on this particular type of work. So I'm going to open it up to my co-hosts to introduce themselves. Susan, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, y'all. My name is Susan Leatham-Sanning, and I am the Associate Dean and Director for Service and Social Innovation at Grinnell College. I come to this work as an employed, upper middle class, cisgendered Irish American Protestant woman who now lives on land that was previously that of the Sauk, Meskwaki, Winnebago, and Sioux Nations. I'm the child of a naval officer who, had he held a different set of identities, likely would have spent his entire life in prison, but instead was never tried. Witnessing this injustice taught me firsthand about racial privilege, about the systemic inequities in our incarceration and judicial systems, and really taught me to understand my own positionality because of that. I'm the child of an environmental teacher and a scientist who taught me to appreciate the sensitivity and resilience of ecosystems and the beauty of the earth. I'm deeply shaped by my theological education in liberation, womanist, and mujerista thought, and by those who taught me that it's not enough just to criticize and deconstruct dominant and oppressive systems, but rather we must also, as self and power aware allies, seek to co-create more equitable systems and societies. As a hospice chaplain, I learned the value of stories, of lived experiences, and especially of legacy making. Together, all of these aspects of my identity and narrative shape how I approach systems of power and privilege, epistemic equity, personal and shared agency, service, and social innovation. And I'm going to hand it over to Max.
What's up, y'all? How you guys doing? My name is Maximilian Max Hill. I am a Master's of Public Policy candidate at the University of Michigan. I just recently graduated from Grinnell College in May of 2020, and I worked with Susan and Kara the last 2 years of my, I guess, undergraduate career. So I come to this work as, a low-income, first-generation African-American, non-denominational Christian man. At some points growing up, I did contend with homelessness and food insecurity. I want to take this time out. I'm not a thug, nor did I grow up in the proverbial hood as it relates to gang culture, but I can just consider myself someone who was like hood adjacent. Growing up, I know some people who do live that life. Understand me? And though I consider myself like liberal leaning, I still have traits that are harmful and can be considered characteristics of toxic masculinity. I have to consistently reconcile my aggression and passivity and find balance when it comes to, my manhood. I think that when I come to this service-oriented work, I really take a disposition of humility, like always assuming that someone knows more than I do about their lived experience. And so let's not internalize, because basically, if you didn't watch how you carried yourself around certain people where I grew up, it could lead to bodily harm. And so I adapt this self-awareness into listening and understanding people's stories in my pursuit of a more equitable society. I'll give it to Kara.
Thanks, Max. I'm Kira Wilson. I'm the Assistant Director of Service and Social Innovation here at Grinnell College, in what we like to call the House of the CLS, Careers, Life, and Service. And I come to this work of service and civic engagement and community development as a white East Coaster living and working in the Midwest, and oftentimes telling somebody else's story in a time and a place where I'm often still learning about the community I'm in. I use my experience in peacemaking with the youth of Northern Ireland, navigating homicide loss through a compounding system that barely has room to recognize the roles of gender and domestic violence as part of its symptoms, and through my Quaker faith in recognizing that we each have access to vital knowledge and the practice to challenge our own biases in personal and institutional ways. My goal is to redesign the cycles of harm reinforced by traditional service and philanthropic efforts, those of gentrification, unacknowledged power, and the shame of self-care and boundaries, and center on a style of service that enhances a shared mission, one that fully acknowledges the human scale of our work. My philosophy of service is founded in a growing understanding of feminist ideas, that communities are experts and agents of their own change, and subscribes to the idea that good service is founded in harm reduction, to not only minimize hurt, but to transform the way we create, feed, and nurture ourselves in community. My goal is to change the way we see ourselves as members of our own space. So we're going to pop into the core elements of our work. Susan.
So when we approach any service or social innovation endeavor, it's important to us that we keep both in balance. And the way that I like to say it to explain that is that service without social innovation, so feeding somebody without solving the issues of food insecurity, can simply reinforce the systems of oppression that we're trying to help through service. And social innovation without service means that we're trying to address those systems and change those systems, but we're not meeting immediate needs. And so it's really important for us to approach both of these things at the same time. And that necessitates being able to work closely with our community with an attitude of respect and trust. And it's only with those kinds of relationships can we have the hard conversations that are necessary. It's also important to us that we come to this with a self-awareness, and we ask the questions: who are we? What kind of power do I hold? What kind of privilege do I hold? How does that affect the relationship? When should I step up? When should I step back? And finally, co-creation as both a mindset, the way we think about the work that we do, as well as the process embedded into every single decision-making process that we have.
Pop this over to Max.
Yeah. So basically, one of the things that we kind of did talk about is trust in the as one of our core tenets of the work that we do. And so start this off by saying that it's my opinion that if the stereotypical hipster liberal went to the proverbial hood, then they would become conservative. I made this joke to my roommate because I really do think it highlights how seeking justice has become like an aesthetic or like a set of passed down values of just looking like a good or nice person. And I do think that this tangent is relevant when talking about trust, because I think it illustrates how issues of poverty, racial exclusion, systemic inequality, they're all talked about in spaces of higher education. Like there's simply no rapport or understanding. And so in my experience, the way I've, seen people talk about the poor or cut off people is from a very distant perspective. One that's just kind of like this didactic ceremony of oblation to one's own egos or feelings of moral superiority. And that's fine if you're trying to feel like a good person, but that only works to insulate yourself from the people you're trying to save, air quotes. And so I think trust is a two-way street, and the way we build is being real with ourselves in an attempt to understand others. So for example, if you do go to the hood, the things that you will see there, it's not going to be pretty. It's not just because of a lack of monetary resources either. It's going to be because a set of social practices that have been internalized or learned. And so when you go there, it's going to be problematic. There are things you probably going to want to cancel. You're going to feel uncomfortable. You might even feel like a hypocrite because you clutch for your purse, you cross the street because some people was walking your direction that you didn't feel comfortable around. And I say that's fine, because then you become aware of your own identity as an outsider, as someone who may not know as much as you think you do. And so after seeing the scope, the depth, the breadth of a community, one may realize that it does not fit into this shallow social justice box that we've learned amidst the peaks of the ivory tower. And that's also fine, because you will then need the assistance of those you're trying to help. And that is reciprocity. And I think which is a pillar of trust. And so this is important because this is what we attempt to do in the Grinnell Social Justice Tour. And basically we start with humility. We recognize our biases and our identities and ask permission to be grafted into the communities that we are trying to serve. And with this posture, I think we are better to help others build capacity. And so that's why we ask, who are you? This is a very important question. And when it comes to our social justice tour, some components of it, it acknowledges the limitations of the dominant narratives of the role of power and privilege in storytelling. It challenges the dominant epistemologies, ways of knowing that shape our relationships and our decisions about how we create change. It prioritizes consistent and continual, also mutual investment in creating a shared understanding of one's community narrative through deliberative dialogue. And fourthly, it encourages a deep respect for the complexity of human beings and their communication, as well as the courage, self-awareness, and humility it takes to enter into a truly inclusive and equitable change-making relationship. So with that, I think we'll go into the social justice tour, correct?
Thanks, Max. I'm gonna pop open, see if I can do it this way, or I might have it over here. But we are gonna pop into the social justice tour. One of the things that we use, is what is it called, Susan? Ooh. This guy.
Arcgis story mapping. Is that what you're looking for, Kira?
Yes, thank you. For my team, can you see this? Great. Arcgis storytelling map is one of the things that we use for our plan here. Okay.
So these
Go ahead,
I'm
Susan.
gonna go ahead and kick us off. This is a tour that up until COVID, we would do in person, either walking or getting in a bus or a car, depending on how much time folks had and what kind of experience they wanted to have. This tour changes and morphs every time we do it. It will morph when we do it with you. It will morph when we do it with other students, depending on who they are, what their interests are, and how they add to the story. We're going to give you a really abbreviated version today and explain more of what we do versus have you actually experience it. We normally ask lots of questions and get people to share their stories, but for the sake of time, we're going to go through it in an explaining mode a little bit more. Basically, what this tour is designed to do is to decolonize dominant community narratives and ask the question, who tells the story of Grinnell or of Grinnell College? And if I were to answer that honestly, from my perspective, where do these stories get told? They get told in admissions. And we want to create this beautiful story of who Grinnell is as this very liberal, socially just, socially conscious school. And so some things are left out of the narrative. In the community, it might be the Chamber of Commerce. And so they tell it a different way. But in the ways in which we tell stories, these dominant narratives appear. And also then you can start to see the biases in those narratives and who is telling those narratives and what they are trying to promote and privilege. And so if we were to tell the parts of the Grinnell story that aren't often told, and if you would scroll up just a little bit, Kira, that would be great. When we tell the story of Grinnell, we often tell this story that Grinnell College was founded by an abolitionist, J.B. Grinnell, who was told to go west, young man, and go and create this community in this college, and that he was very active in the Underground Railroad and abolishing slavery. But what we don't say is that the very missionaries, the missionaries of whom J.B. Grinnell was a part of, were also very involved in getting a Black exclusion law passed in the territory and state legislature that basically said that if you were a Black person and wanted to stay in the state of Iowa, you had to pay $500. Now, what person on the Underground Railroad had $500? And so you start to see why Iowa looks the way that it does if we tell more of that story. We also don't say that J.B. Grinnell was told, go west, young man, from the East Coast at the very same time that the Sauk, Meskwaki, Sioux, and Winnebago people were being forced off of this land. That creates a very different picture of go west, young man, and steal people's homes, right? We also don't tell the story of Chief Powashik, who had a tribe just north of where we are as a college, and he was the only Native American chief to successfully petition the U.S. government to purchase land. And so the settlement just north of us isn't a reservation, it is a settlement with nation status. We don't tell that story. We don't tell the story of how 14% of all farms nationwide in the 20s are Black owned, but if we fast forward, now only 2% of those are. And we don't talk about the connection to the New Deal. But we do say, oh, Harry Hopkins is a Grinnell graduate. He helped create the New Deal, and look at all these wonderful things that happened. But we don't talk about part of that New Deal being, if you needed a loan, for example, you had to be a white male. And so we don't talk about the Mexican farm labor, the Bracero program. This is what I mean by the dominant narratives, how we tell the community story, either historically or in the present, and in a minute we're going to get into the present, really changes the way that we understand our community, the way that we partner, and how we co-create or don't co-create change. Go ahead, Kira.
Thanks. So Susan has brought us to the, socially just co-creating, and a lot of our work through service and social innovation at Grinnell is really grounded in this feminist, womanist philosophy, with understanding that if Black women are experts of their own reality, they must be agents of their own future. And we can apply that also to communities, saying if communities are experts of their own experience, then they are the agents of their own future in that. And one of the things that we look at is to really be an ally in this kind of agency building And to be that kind of change agent, we have to seek to understand minoritized realities, these histories and narratives, things that we aren't talking about all the time, right? And only then can we really begin to build that trust necessary to create a new, more socially just and equitable community. So the things that Max was talking about earlier regarding trust and building that up. And so one of the ways that we do this is that we offer this kind of tour, walking or online and otherwise, to support people's growing understanding of the space that they're coming into, the community that they're going to take part in. Or even for folks who've been here for 10, 15 years, oftentimes might find themselves on this tour learning something new about their own space. So let's kick it off, and I'll hand it over to Max to start off our Grinnell narrative.
Yeah. So can you get when we first start off the tour, we start at the JRC building, for those familiar with it, we asked the question, it's like, what is the current unemployment rate? Also, keep in mind that these are the pre-pandemic numbers. So we'd ask, like, what is the current unemployment rate? People give the answer, they'd be like, it's 5%, it's 6% all the way up to 10%, which is pretty high. But the current unemployment rate in Grinnell is about 2.7%. While the national average is about 3%. Next, we would ask, what is the percent of students of high schools, of students in high school through K through 12 facing food insecurity? I say like 15%, like 10%, they think farms, people can eat food and things like that. But if we go by the amount of students on the free and reduced lunches, that number is probably around 40%. And then lastly, we ask, what is the poverty rate in Grinnell? And if we go, we'll have numbers, it's like 20%, 15, things like that. But if we're going by like United Way or different metrics, the poverty rate in Grinnell is about 40 to 50%. And this begs the question, is like, if the unemployment rate is 2.7, but the poverty rate is upwards nearing half of the population, there's this missing piece, there's this gap. And that answer is chronic underemployment. And so I'm originally from LA, Los Angeles area. Let me state that. I came to Grinnell, I'm thinking everybody's gonna be a farmer. But instead I see a lot of people working at the school while also working at Walmart later on that night. Or you have people holding multiple jobs and things like that. And what this does, it has ripple effects for the community. And it adds a little bit more nuance to the story, because if kids are underperforming in school, what does that say? It's that parents may not have enough time because they're working multiple jobs. They might not have the energy to cook when they come home after trying to provide for their family. When it comes to transportation, extracurricular activities, can their parents drive them to practice if they're not salaried employees? So these are some of the things that we want to consider when looking at Grinnell, because it just adds a little bit more depth and breadth to the narrative. So, yeah.
Thanks, Max. I'm going to take us into the kind of the tour and where we are. You'll see this map here, and this is Grinnell as a town. You'll see the grid. You can kind of see the houses. We can get a little bit closer there. But Max brings up a lot of really good points about what does a small town really look like. And one of the questions we ask is, have small towns struggled like this all the time? What are the changes we've seen? And one of the things we look at is that, the early economics of Grinnell, if we look historically, was actually really serving the needs of the dominant group. So we're looking at lots of farm families, we're looking at drive goods stores, we're looking at locally owned and operated businesses. If there was a need to be filled, there was a way to fill that. So the early economics of Grinnell is actually pretty robust. But over the last 100 years, we see an economic shift. We see the Great Depression. And when we think about the Great Depression, or when we ask students about the Great Depression, what they remember, what they think about, they often think about a very urban view, that of people lining up, waiting for a soup line, or potentially waiting in line to get a job. And that idea of the Great Depression is really wrapped up in this urban view. While in Iowa, the Great Depression didn't have the same impact. because the work here was very agricultural based, not necessarily wrapped up in the stock market. And so that was one of the things that shifted, or when we think about what the economics looked like. We also sometimes hear a little bit about the Dust Bowl. We're thinking about the Dust Bowl, it comes up, but when we think about the Dust Bowl here, it actually didn't impact Iowa quite the same way as other Midwestern spaces, in part because at that point, Iowa was still pretty heavily a prairie. One of the things we talk about is how deep those prairie roots can run as an upside down rainforest, and also the second largest carbon sink in the world. But, you know, for that, the Dust Bowl didn't happen, in part, or not quite so much, in part because our land was so rooted, right? And then we come up to about the 1980s. And for some of us out there might remember the 1980s, right? And this is where your expertise comes in, is that in the 1980s, the US went into kind of global agricultural markets, and we actually see the farm crisis. And the farm crisis hits the Midwest much harder than, say, the coasts, in a very different way. And we see that the land prices fall because the overall crop price that we can get here is, you know, we have to make it cheaper. And to do that, you have to do it in bulk. And this is where we really see that agricultural system shift from family farms to that of larger agribusiness. And when we make that shift from family farms to agribusiness, the families themselves also change. And when we think, one of the questions we ask about is like, who's the first person to come off the farm? Who's the first person to leave the farm looking for non-agricultural work? And most often we see that it's women from the family going into towns, going to seek out what looks to be lower paying work and jobs. And we begin to see what Max is talking about, where we're seeing a crunch on time, but we're also seeing low paid positions. And we're also beginning to see the increase of multiple people, or people having multiple jobs. And I'm going to move us then into agriculture with Susan.
So the picture of the farm that you see there on the left is Grinnell Heritage Farm. It has been in this particular family for 150 years. And this family has actually lived the changes that Kira was talking about. So much so that, well, let's back up a little bit. The other thing that they do is they are still trying to farm in a small family farm way, sustainable and organic, and paying living wages to the folks who are employed by them. What they have found is there's not really a market for that kind of expensive food in Grinnell. And you can think about all the things that Max was saying about the economics. You can think about supply and demand. When you go to the grocery store and you see two different priced eggs, what decisions do you make and how? And so what this family has had to do is one of the family members went to town to work. It was, and it was very hard for her to do. And what has happened in the past year is they have actually gone out of business because they could not compete. And that's for all different kinds of reasons. One of the things that happened to them was that the laws in Iowa are written in such a way that when crop dusters are spraying herbicides and pesticides on the surrounding land, and you can see with number 2 is where this farm is located, and right above that there's a farm that's a corporate farm land that's there. And when they spray that with herbicides and pesticides, there's something called drift. And the organic laws are written in such a way that if your fields are contaminated, you have no recourse against either the person in the crop duster or the owner of the farm. And you have to take your land out of production for 4 years to be recertified. So this really prefers the larger corporate organic way of living. Kiara, do you want to move on? So what starts happening? We start seeing more corporate agriculture. There at number 3, you can see something called Bayer. This was formerly Monsanto. This is just east of town. And this particular facility dries corn and soybeans and does a number of other things as well. It's one of the largest employers in town. One of the things that we try to do on this tour is problematize rather than demonize. This is one of the places that our young people can often get the best paying jobs. And so when you're in a community where economic instability is very common, finding those jobs is really important. And so Bayer really does pay well. They do, a lot of kids do something called detasseling. And we can go into what that is later. But all of this new information is really important for our students. Most of our students, only about 8% of our students come from Iowa and some of the surrounding communities. Most of them come from, like as Max was saying, LA, the coastal regions, Chicago. And so this is a really eye-opening experience. The thing that's happened with organizations like Bayer and Monsanto is it's vertically integrated. So what is happening is they are controlling even the family farms that still exist around them. The corporations sell the seed that you have to plant, tell you what you have to put on it in terms of herbicides and pesticides, buy it back from you as long as you have done what they have said, and then the cycle continues. And no longer can you create your own or grow your own seed because most of this seed is infertile. So it creates these relationships of dependence. I just talked a little bit about what happens with folks who are growing crops, but the same thing happens in the meat industry as well.
So one of the stops on the social justice tour is the Drake Community Library, smack dab in the middle of downtown. And basically this place, I'll just start off by saying it's a community center, right? A lot of people ask students, hey, what are libraries used for? They say books, they say internet. But in Grinnell, again, we've been kind of having this idea that the story goes deeper. The library is a community center because a lot of, let me just put it this way, librarians have become pseudo social workers in a sense that the internet's there, people come in, they help them apply for SNAP benefits. They help them with workforce development. They help them with accessing internet. The library, yes, provides books, provides internet, but also Iowa gets cold. There was just a polar vortex. I'm in Michigan, but not too different. But it provides heat when it's cold outside. It provides some air conditioning when it's hot and humid out there. And so this is a place that does a lot more for the community than it would be in an urban area. I can say that. There are community rooms where people can do presentations. There's a coding club that is held at the library. There is a senior educational program that any given night, 75 older people will be packed in that library to just hear somebody talk, just to kind of expand their mind. So it does a lot more for Grinnell than the typical one. And just we take. I mean, I'm kind of speaking from personal experience, coming from an urban area, we take it for granted. They're kind of like, libraries, like, do you even use them or just download the books as PDF type deal? But I digress. Secondly, one of the big things that we're talking about is it provides internet, which is a big thing. A lot of students, they operate off tablets, operate off Zoom. It's literally Zoom University. The pandemic brought about like virtual education. But Grinnell still has DSL because it's not a big enough market for private businesses to actually make money off of. And so they don't even take the time to lay fiber in the ground. And so with this, for example, Susan, how much do you pay for internet?
So I don't live in the city limits. Where there is, you can get some internet service. I live about 7 miles outside of town, and I pay close to $400 a month because my only option is a cell phone modem, and there is only one provider that provides cell phone service to where I am.
Yep.
My neighbors can't afford internet service.
And that was going to be my next point. She's a salaried employee at Grinnell College, so she can afford that. A lot of people can't afford $400 for some internet. And again, that talks about the learning gap that is in rural areas. Are kids really regressing the way it is, or can they just do their homework? Do they choose to go home, or they choose to go to the library and not being able to get back home, when the lights come on, when it gets dark? So these are some of the considerations we have to ask ourselves when we talk about urban versus the rural divide, especially in Grinnell. So yeah, I'm gonna pass it back to Kira.
Actually, I think this is me.
Sorry about that.
So in my previous life, I was a hospice chaplain, and I learned more about rural healthcare than I had ever learned before, because up until I moved to the Grinnell area, I'd always been a big city person. And I was really surprised to learn that Grinnell healthcare professionals are reimbursed at the lowest rate in the nation. That means a practitioner about 40, 50, 60 miles away would be earning maybe $1.03 for every dollar they spend, so that they have room to earn a little bit. In Grinnell, it's 67 cents on the dollar, which means it's very difficult for us to recruit and retain medical professionals. It also means that our healthcare system relies on the community in order to continue. Taxes aren't enough. Reimbursement is based off of Medicare, Medicaid rates, and we have one major healthcare insurance provider in town, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and they set their rates at the same rate as the government does. About 15, 20 years ago, one of our senators put forth a fix. And this is one of the reasons why we tell the stories, is because very often the people who are trying to fix these problems aren't living with them. And so the ways in which they write policy to help often hurts more than it helps. And so the idea was, all of these hospitals throughout the Midwest and in rural settings that are earning 67 cents on the dollar for every dollar that they spend, we're going to give them the option to be critical access hospitals. And this has been in the news a bit more because of the challenges with COVID, but basically what that means is stabilize and move on. We are in a community where folks don't necessarily have access to transportation. We don't really have a public transportation system. Folks can't necessarily afford their own cars. So what that means is that not only could you not get specialized care in this small rural community, you couldn't be there to advocate for your loved one. So what happens when these folks are transferred into the big cities? I say the more big cities because Des Moines felt very small when I moved here. But they don't get the same advocacy as someone else who does have an advocate at the bedside. Grinnell decided the community decided not to become a critical access hospital. And they did it for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is they thought it was really important that our community have access to obstetrics, to podiatrists, to oncologists, etc. And so the community decided that it was just going to make up the difference. And Max was talking about the poverty rate and issues of income insecurity in the community. What I will also say is there's this massive divide between folks who are salaried and have more income and folks who don't. And so it was really pulling on our foundations and on our wealthy folks in the community to keep this hospital going. It is still going this way. We have found some relief in collaborating with larger hospital systems and economies of scale. But this is a real challenge. We have the highest percentage of per capita of senior citizens in the Midwest living in Grinnell. And part of that was by design. J.B. Grinnell really wanted this vibrant community where students and elders came together to enrich each other. And so that was part of it by design, but it was also the flight from the farms that also brought people to Grinnell. And it brought people to Grinnell because we had these kinds of healthcare opportunities as well. As you age, you need healthcare. Whoops, something happened there. Anyway, so that's just a little bit more about the healthcare in our community. And I think we've got one more, Kira.
I think it's me. So yeah, again, I keep alluding to the fact that I'm from the Los Angeles area is because when I came to Grinnell, I saw the way that people interact. Obviously, it's a smaller community, and the way that they foster innovation is it's pragmatic in the sense that, you know, a lot of small mom and pop stores don't exist anymore in the Midwest that they used to back around the times. I think Kara was talking about like the Dust Bowl and things like that. And because of that, businesses cannot really, competition competition is kind of necessary, but they do more so of collaboration. And so what I mean by that is, for example, the Grinnell Chamber of Commerce, in order to spur kind of, some economic, economic innovation in downtown, they held a pitch competition for a more, I guess, like a ritzy, upclass, bougie dining center, which the outcome was Prairie Canary, which was a restaurant that kind of held that kind of status of like the ritzy place downtown and things like that. And they basically paid for like either paid for the kitchen and things like that, allowed the woman who started it to come in, make the profit. And then after that, she sold it to another person in town who now operates the business. Another example is, Susan talked about the highest rate of elderly people per capita in the Midwest. We have a coffee shop called Saints Rest. And, two businesses operate. They have the coffee shop and then they have 1947 Deli in the back. And so it looks different because a lot of small businesses are competing with places like Walmart, places like Hy-Vee, Fairway, Dollar Tree, Dollar General. And so in order to kind of keep their identity as this community-oriented place, they have to look to collaboration instead of competition, which obviously looks different in an urban environment because everybody's just trying to be at people's necks and just compete in order to make the profit and things like that, which is not the case in Grinnell. Maybe that. I think Kira, pass it on to you to cap it.
Thanks, Max. I'm gonna bring us back to the slideshow. So we talked a lot in this kind of context building of Grinnell, this social justice tour of this space, and there are deeper pieces to each of these. Our community partners and members are doing all sorts of really interesting things to raise the minimum wage in this area to ensure that women entrepreneurs are on the ground and moving. And so there's a lot more to this tour, but this is just a quick taste. So this tour is actually co-created. A lot of these stories, like I said in the very beginning, they're not my stories, right? They are stories from the community and from different members. And so when we do our work in service and social innovation, what do we mean by co-create? And we really mean two things. One is this mindset that includes an ethic of mutual listening and learning, that we're there together, and we're in this relationship of decision-making agency, right? And really putting on that mindset of that particular work. A lot of the things that we see around us are not set up in this particular mindset. And then second, there's a process that actively engages all partners and aspects of building something, the kind of cooperative preparation, the definition of the project and its goals, the implementation and assessment, right? So this actual process of doing things together and co-creating something together. And so this is what we really kind of land on as a foundation for our work. I'll move us. Susan.
So what you see in front of you is Kolb's experiential learning cycle. And most experiential learning really starts with experience. The social justice tour actually came out of Kira and my frustration being asked to do service projects during new student orientation. Just get them out there to experience and we'll have them reflect. And that sort of rubbed Kira and I wrong for any number of reasons. But we started recognizing that part of the problem that we saw with this experiential learning cycle is that it starts with experience rather than reflection. It assumes that you know everything that you need to know to go in and do no harm, or to go in knowing who you are and to make a difference. And I think what happens instead is institutions like Grinnell that is incredibly wealthy, y'all. We're talking billions of dollars in endowment. Coming into a community like Grinnell, we really become the gentrifying force when we come in thinking we know what others need and how to help them. And so instead, what we really want to do is start with critical self-reflection. Reflection that asks, who am I? What identities do I hold? What privileges do I have? What identities are oppressed? And so given that, what does it mean to enter into honest, mutual co-creating relationships where I can do something in that experience that is co-created, that recognizes the importance of trust and relationships first and understanding. And this kind of reflection can happen not only with our students, but also with our faculty and our community members themselves. And in that we can grow. And not only should it be the first place that we start, but then it needs to become a lens or a place that we do all throughout the co-creating process. So Kira was talking about co-creating being both a mindset and a process. This self-reflection is part of that mindset, and it is a constant in that process. So what happens when I do that self-reflection before experiencing? What happens when I share, if I do that with a self-reflective component to it? What happens when I process it? Oh my goodness, who I am might not be who I started out thinking that I was, right? What kind of generalizations am I making? And what biases might I bring to that changes the way that I tell the story, or that I tell my story or another person's story? And then going back through this again. So this is a real problem we see with this learning cycle, and we're trying to challenge it through opportunities like the social justice tour that challenge our ways of knowing.
So we are going to move into a reflection period, and I'm going to offer you, I'm going to pop this into the chat for those folks who are like me, who need to read the stuff, not just online, but need to have it in your hands as closely I can get to your hands as possible. I just added a quick link for a Google Drive of a number of pieces of our program that we're going to do today. The self-awareness exercise. I'll also pop up the questions here. Susan's been doing a great job running through the chat and answering some questions in the chat. And I know one of the questions that popped up very early on is what do you define as hard or difficult, right? And I will tell you, I find this one difficult. And so I think part of what we practice here is really figuring out in the context and space of what you're working on, what seems challenging in that moment, right? In the context and space of the community, your community is going to look a little different than Grinnell, right? Or maybe it looks really similar and we have a lot to connect on in that factor. So I just want to again repeat that I've shared a link to our self-awareness reflection exercise, as well as some following exercise information. And if you don't have that, or you can't click that and be running around on phones, etc., I encourage you to, pull up a notes app or grab a piece of paper and pen. And we're gonna spend a little bit of time focusing on this. And then we're gonna break folks up into a small group to briefly chat with some other folks in the group, and then bring us back for our final crafting of our own tour outline. So we really want to begin to identify our positionality and potential impacts of our identities and biases. You will have heard all of us talk a little bit about what our positionality is, what are our biases, what are the things that we are bringing into this tour, right? And in the ways that it shapes the narrative of our community relationships. And we're going to give folks about, I think about 7 to 10 minutes to do the following. And I'm going to bring us over here. So 1 and 2, giving yourself a little bit of time. 1, share about a time when someone didn't get it. They tried to help in a way that just hurt more. Maybe what biases prevented folks from really getting it or understanding. And 2, how do you work to get it? How do you listen? Not just with your ears, right? Maybe what you're looking for, but how do you listen most often? And then whose perspectives do we inadvertently dismiss or miss? And I want you to really think about explicit examples. Really writing that down. We're going to give you a couple of minutes to work on that one, and I'm going to pop up a third question in just a few minutes. As folks are working on those first 2 questions, and a couple of folks are joining us in this conversation, I want to pop up our third question here. thinking a little bit about your first and second question about those explicit moments. Think about, for 3, name the lenses, filters, or biases that shape the way you understand someone's story: age, economic situation, gender, race, etc. Write about a time where 2 to 3 of these lenses affected your experience and the understanding of your community. We're going to give you another probably 3 minutes to work on this as a whole. With just a couple of moments left, I'm going to ask Susan, my co-presenter here, to break us out into small groups. You'll have about 7 to 10 minutes to chat with some folks here to share a little bit about what you're learning or what perspective that you want, that you're learning in this kind of work. We ask you to share what you feel comfortable with, and also to be able to hear and listen to folks in that space. And we ask that even if you hear something really great, not to share somebody else's story, but if you hear something really great and you want to encourage one of your collaborators to share that, please let them know.
I think I will add, and Michelle added in the chat, the breakout rooms are not recorded. And I think this is really important because these are some of the hard conversations that we were asking you to have and to challenge by choice. And now we're going to say share by choice.
All right, here comes everybody.
I think we've got everybody.
All right.
Okay. So
okay.
we have a bit of an apology to make. We thought we had 90 minutes. We're going to have to go quickly through the rest of this. We're supposed to be done at 2:45. And so what we're going to do is walk you through the questions. Kira's putting the link to creating your own tour in the chat. We're going to walk through the questions that we would have done through workshopping together in small groups. So the first question that we would have asked is, what stories are being told in your community, and to what effect? Who's being left out? We talked a little bit about the Grinnell story and what was being left out. Why was it being left out? What would happen if you added it back in? How does that expose biases? How does it decolonize the narrative? If we're to reconstruct narratives, who needs to be involved? So Ken had asked a really good question. Was it Ken? No.
Yes.
Somebody had asked a really good question about has the community been frustrated by this tour? And it's actually the opposite. Folks really want to share their stories. They want their stories to be added to this. The tour usually is an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And so we really get into those stories. So if we're to reconstruct the narratives, who needs to be involved? What stories need to be told, and how are you going to do that? You want to move on, Kira?
Yes, and then Michelle is saying that we have a little bit of flex time, so you can co-speech.
Okay, because we want to give some time for comments and conversation too. Yep. Next one, what stories need to be included based on your own personal experience? Because remember, we were talking at the very beginning, experience as expertise. There are perspectives that Kira brings as a rural Pennsylvania person. There are perspectives that I bring as a hospice chaplain who's worked all over the state of Iowa for 15 years or so and was of this sort of weird insider-outsider relationship now to community members. Max as a student, and particularly as a Black male student at our campus. We all have different expertise. So according to your expertise, what may need to be added? And then based on who you've highlighted in all of these questions to be included, what stories will you need to seek out help to create the narrative? And it's a lot of fun doing this, y'all. And if you start small and you start bringing people into the conversation and you start with a small tour and you start doing it with the community, they'll add, they really will. And asking permission to tell those stories is, when we have asked to tell those stories, folks most often will say, oh, absolutely, yes. Or they'll say, you can't tell this part, but here's some context, right? And so that co-creation really starts to happen. Okay, next, Kira. How do the stories fit together? And not only how do they fit together, but how do they start to reveal systemic challenges, opportunities, strengths of the different communities? because it's really important to start connecting the strings. One of the things that our students very often will say is, oh my goodness, because we have done the tour with a critical race lens. We very often are asked to do this. Can you do this from a purely global economic perspective? And then that's the lens through which we tell it, or critical race theory. And so the systems start fitting together differently according to how you end up focusing on the tour. Once the narratives are reconstructed, how do they fit together systemically? Are there common threads? And then accountability. How do you have accountability? How do you do this humbly? Invariably, with whatever community that we're doing this with, whether at a campus community, a local community, architects from New York who are going to build a downtown student residence hall, combinations of all of these things, invariably, we all start telling stories from different perspectives. And how do we, if Kira and I are telling these stories, or Kira and Max and I, or Max, how do we stay accountable to the people for whom these stories are meaningful and it's their experience? Because we always have to remember that not everybody is telling their story firsthand when we're doing this. And so how do we where does accountability come from, and how are you going to build that into this? I've found sometimes our youth, our high school students are really good at this. They're really honest. It's a lot of fun to do this with them because they'll say, oh, you left this out, you know, why did you leave this out? Well, I didn't know about it, or well, you know, you share that, and they'll bring it back.
And one of the things I'll say on your worksheets is that when you start to get into this space of creating your own tour, how do the stories fit together, there's actually space set aside for you to draw out those connections. Susan will tell you time and again, I am a drawer, give me the whiteboard. But that's a nice way to be able to make the connections between the different themes that you're starting to see that are happening and evolving in your space.
I think the other thing that isn't on here, but who is going to lead these tours? When Kira leads the tour, it looks very different than when I lead the tour. It looks very different than when Max leads the tour. And you know, why are you choosing to do it? Are you doing it as a group like we did? Very often when Max and Kira and I do this together, we interrupt each other constantly. That is hard to do on Zoom. It just doesn't work the same way. And we'll say, whoa, wait, I would add this, or Max did a little bit of it, throw it back. Susan, what do you pay for internet, right? You'll find that this becomes a very dynamic process. And because we're comfortable interrupting each other and saying, I'm gonna hold you accountable here, your participants will learn to do the same thing as well.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to share a couple of things before we head out. This is also in your packet. Tools we use, community organizations, Creative Reaction Lab. Creative Reaction Lab is actually here at Ashoka, so give them, you know, find some of their work. We love working with them. And then some information about recasting the narrative. We could spend a long time talking about what it means to look at changing the narrative, changing the history that we know, and understanding how we become storytellers in those spaces that really open us up for those connections and to really bring together a community. So I'll leave those here, but we also have that in the packet. And I just want to leave some space open for folks who have questions, folks who want to know more about something. I know you've been sharing resources in the chat. If there's something else you'd like to share, why don't you throw that into the chat, and Susan, Max, and I can help answer those questions in the in-between space now.
Actually, Kira, would you mind stopping sharing, and then we can see each other's faces?
Yeah.
And if folks feel comfortable just unmuting and talking or raising their hand, then we can see everybody, and I think it would be a dynamic space. Questions, concerns, challenges, things that you would like to see differently in our own social justice tour. If you have expertise that you'd like to add, go.
Very cool. Cool.
I think that means we did a good job, huh?
Or not.
Natalie.
No, I just want to say this was a very, very educational session. So I don't have as much to add as an expert or anything, but I did really enjoy the presentation and everything you put together. I found it really fascinating, and I love that. I work at George Mason University, and we recently also were trying to kind of reconcile with our past. And you know, we're named after George Mason, who had owned slaves, and so we've been trying to, you know, pull those things together and honor the slaves that, you know, he had owned, and bring awareness of their stories, and kind of this side of good but also very bad history and how it's related. So I just love kind of seeing how you've done that too at your college. And I think it's just a really important conversation to have as we move forward and try to reconcile those things, bring awareness to those things. So I really appreciate it. Thanks for such a great session.
Thanks, Natalie. Anne.
I would just echo what Natalie just said, and also say that I'm at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we are also doing a lot of reckoning with our past. And I mean, I think that hopefully the whole world is doing that of late. But I love that you have, I mean, there was a lot of information, really good. I love that I can go back to that website and look through that again. It's nice that it's, you've got a little bit of a roadmap. And I did just take training at the Racial Equity Institute that's in Greensboro, North Carolina. Are you all familiar with that?
That's mine.
I'm sorry if I missed that at the beginning. I kind of had a
no,
little technical glitch.
Not at all. That's just where I went. That's where I went to school for a long time. So I love for North Carolina.
Yes. Okay. Well, so that the REI, they just have great programming as well. That's all talking about our past related to racial equity and yeah, it's just a lot, but I'm really excited to be learning in this space and trying to better myself. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks y'all for being here. Ken, thank you for your chat, your insights on the chat. We really appreciate that as well.
Oh, thanks. Can I have give something comment about the session?
Yeah.
Okay. From my experience in the business field, and sometimes I feel when I listen to the story in the corporate field, business field, so only small number of stories, but actually, so some story touches on spiritual or conscious mind, because that's the reason why I'm here, or that's the reason I don't care of the getting the money. So just I'm working for something bigger than me. So here's my question about the session. So did you feel something the same as I feel in the business sector when you listen to a story and collecting a story? And so did you feel the same?
So if I understand your question and your comment, you are working in your industry to do more than just earn money.
Yes.
And you're asking if we feel the same way.
Yes. Conscious mind or spiritual mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I have now the work of my heart that I'm doing now, right? And to me, it is doing this work to inspire, empower my community and my colleagues and the students to continue this work. How do we together create tools and processes to make this a better place? And so I don't go to work anymore, and I'm privileged to be able to say I don't go to work to earn money anymore. I'm now comfortable. Max might be in a little different situation there.
Yeah.
But yeah.
That moment, so some of my friends, some of my colleagues, see this is a moment when I look at the subconscious mind. So in the usual situation, we can't see any kind of subconscious mind, but so all of a sudden, so something take me to the subconscious. Here you are, or something like that. Hopefully, when I listen to your deep bottom story from the session.
I think you bring up a good point, and I think one of the reasons why I think the self-reflection in community is important is that that's how we uncover some of the unconscious, right?
Oh, yes.
So, you know, if I start sharing my reflections with Max and he shares his reflections with me,
yes,
he say, you don't see this about yourself, Susan, but, and Kira and I will have knockdown drag outs trying to get at this, right? And I think that's part of the beauty of the co-creating.
Oh,
It's not just co-creating of the tour, but it's co-creating of our understanding of ourselves as well.
Yes, yes, yes.
And I think the part that I'll add to that is that, but like I can only see from where I'm stationed, right? And I can sometimes I can move around and get to a different place. But Max and Susan and yourself are all gonna have different visions of what we see. The same thing is gonna go on. In the beginning, we talked about trust, right? I have to trust that Susan can see something I cannot see, either in the world and the work that we're doing, or even in the way I'm approaching it, right? And to be able to have partners in that work, to be able to co-create in that work, it means I trust the folks to say, hey, Kira, you're subconsciously not seeing this thing. There's this thing that's underneath your radar. And for me to know, like, that's, you know, that's the hard, those are some of the hard conversations where, you know, I also have to be humble enough and secure enough in myself to accept that I didn't get it right. Or I didn't see the thing that other people see, right? And so I think that with that co-creation, not just with one partner or two, but having many partners in your community co-creating something, we begin to get a vision of things that we might not have seen ourselves as an individual.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ken. We really appreciated it. And I love that you were here.